Hello, I'm Reggie Turner, and I'm here with Terrence Moore and Jim Miller. The Flipside starts right now. Welcome to the show. Today, our special guest is Ed Maliskas. He is the author of John Brown to James Brown, among other works that highlight the historical aspects of John Brown's farm in our community. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into the amazing works that you have done, tell us a little bit about who is Ed Maliskas?
I'm a history major at the University of Illinois by the skin of my teeth. And while I was there, I was also in a soul band, Eddie and Sensations. I wasn't good enough to be a sensation, I just had to be Eddie. But I was familiar with soul music and had older cousins that had records that got me hip to R&B at a fairly young age. And so when we moved here after my pastoring at a church in Florida for 20 years, we came up about this time of year, cold, didn't have any warm weather clothing. We stopped in at L&L Consignments. It was run by Leela and Lola, twin sisters, and I was chatting up one of the husbands, and R&B was on in the background. James Brown Jam came on, and I said, well, when I was a kid, I was in a band, we played that song. Same thing with the Temptations tune, and he just kind of out of the blue said, you know, I think you really would love the music scene at John Brown's farm. And I was like, okay, John Brown the abolitionist? And he's like, I have no idea. We just called it John Brown's farm. But man, the wheels were turning from that point on. It's like, if that really was John Brown the abolitionist, and this guy, a little older than me, was going to dances back there in the 50s and seeing the stars of R&B, just got me going between my history thing and my musical background. Just that there's some kind of crazy connection going on there. If John Brown was there in 1859 and James Brown was there in 1959, and I was just turned on from that moment on to find out what's going on.
So you came to Hagerstown for another pastor engagement, is that true?
I did. I came up to help a buddy originally, and so that's what got us up here. But I think the real reason we're up here is this story.
Wow.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think things like that happen by coincidence. That's a path that seems like there's a purpose tied to it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you speak about John Brown's farm and the story about John Brown being an abolitionist, when I didn't know anything about John Brown until I moved here to Hagerstown, Maryland, and just recently started learning about it. It wasn't in my history books. It was nothing mentioned about it. It wasn't taught in New York City where I came from. And then to hear the story and hear more about how this could be tied to the spark of the Civil War, like this act right here. Tell us a little bit about the significance of the farm and how it tied to the Civil War.
Okay, yeah, so John Brown is quite a character. I mean, he is probably the most divisive person in American history. The war broke out over what he did. I think without John Brown's activity in Kansas particularly, Kansas would have come in as a slave state. The majority of the Senate would have been pro-slavery. The Supreme Court would have been packed in pro-slavery interests, and we might have fought the Civil War in airplanes, if ever, if he hadn't come along. And so, I mean, that's the guy. He called out both the North and the South. It was convenient to be anti-slavery in the North because it didn't cost you anything. It was just virtue signaling back in its day. And then when he did what he did, the South was kind of in a fix because here was a principled man, which they appreciated. But when they saw what he did and almost did single-handedly, it freaked them out. They got their state militias going, and a couple years later, the Civil War is on. And so without John Brown doing what he did in Kansas and then again at Harper's Ferry, some people even think that we might still have the Western Hemisphere might be a slave empire from at least the Canadian border all the way down to Patagonia. I mean, it was not a dying institution. And so he's a guy, he's a player. And so by mid-20th century then, largely based on a biography by W.E.B. Du Bois of John Brown, the black community was quite aware of John Brown and revered him above for his personal sacrifice above Abraham Lincoln. And so when the centennial of the raid comes around in 1959, there was a national discussion about how are we going to do this? Are we going to honor this guy or vilify this guy, John Brown? What are we really going to do here? So there's that piece there.
Yeah, and I think not only is he studied for the history, but he's also studied for ethics, right? Because he really believed the violence in the violent way that he addressed slavery was just, and he was a very religious man as well. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of professors use that as a topic to really to study the ethics of when is violence truly just. Mm-hmm.
So talk about some of the specific things that he did, some of the highlights of his process and how he made these changes. I mean, because you just don't walk in and yes, you can, I mean, there's ostensibly no TVs that he's going to get on CNN and make his case. How do you make a case that reaches across the nation that at that point had little, if any, communication infrastructure?
So going back to 1855, 56 in Kansas, his kids are out there trying, because Kansas, once it gets to the requisite 50,000 people living there, they can petition to become a state. And so people from the South are sending people in, people from the North are sending people in. The South is full of veterans from the Mexican War, and they're coming in with guns, and they're intimidating the free soilers up in Lawrence, Kansas. And Brown's kids say, "Dad, come out here. I mean, this place is just a wilderness. It's a no man's land. It's every man for himself. It's wild." So one of the earliest things that Brown hears is a bunch of these border ruffians from the South saying they're going to wipe out a number of homesteads, and it includes his own family's homestead. I've got Wyatt Earp on my mom's side of the family, and when I was just a kid, I had some older aunts that knew Wyatt Earp, and I was thinking, oh, this guy's a hero, right, aunties? And they're like, he was a frontiersman. I mean, he was a bad boy. He could be a gunslinger, or he could be a marshal. He could be any of those things. And that kind of gave me insight into what Kansas was like. The provisional governor of Kansas was pro-slavery, and so if something happened to an abolitionist, he would just turn his eyes away from it. And so Brown knew it was lawless. He heard these people were going to wipe out his own children and grandchildren, and he took matters into his own hand. He pulled these people out of their houses and had them executed. So he didn't do it by his own hand, but he ordered those executions. But it was, in his mind, just a preemptive strike. It's either they kill my family and law comes in later, or I step in now and my family doesn't die. And that's the way he was looking at that. So until he stepped in there, the Jayhawks, the Free Staters, looks like they were just going to lose Kansas, and like I said earlier, Kansas was going to come in as a slave state. So from that point on, he's got a bounty on his head, and he goes underground. He's soliciting funds and trying to raise up a little bit of a militia with this idea that he could actually get rid of slavery without any bloodshed. His way that he was going to do that is to undermine slavery as an economic system. And so the idea was that a young, male, healthy black slave was worth somewhere between a year and 2 years' salary. So the typical white man in the South was not a plantation owner with 50, 100, 200 slaves. It was a guy that had one slave, maybe two slaves. But if you could get a slave, then you could double your own labor. I'm a farmer, but I can get a slave. I can do the work of now 2 men. And I could get to be somebody if I just had a slave or two. But on the other hand, if that slave dies on me, I've lost the equivalent in today's terms, $50,000, $100,000. And I liken it to, like, if you have a pizza business and you can make the best pizza in town, but you've got this fantastic pizza oven, but it's a weird pizza oven. It can get up and run away. Well, you don't want a pizza oven like that that can get up and run away. So Brown was thinking like that. Economically, if I can get enough pizza ovens, he was a friend of black people, so he wouldn't have thought it in mechanistic terms like that.
No, I get it.
But if I can get enough slaves just to run away, then who in the world wants to have a slave? And so he was just going to do that, do the raid on Harper's Ferry, get guns, get up into the hills of Virginia. He had a constitution written up. He was just going to call, if you can find me. The word would be out on the Underground Railroad. Brown was friends with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. They all trusted him, all loved him. But if he can get up in the hills of Virginia and get just even 100, maybe 1,000 slaves to come run into the hills of Virginia, find him, he would protect them up there. He had that military experience. Then he thought, within a couple of years, maybe I can ruin slavery as an economic institution.
And did his efforts, and obviously his efforts amounted to, had other consequences which ultimately helped get rid of slavery, but did his efforts relative to that Underground Railroad, what was the result of that?
His work specifically in the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, and trying to get the 1,000 people.
Okay, kind of separate deal. So until he gets captured there, wounded, captured, ultimately tried and hung in Harper's Ferry and the environs there. His work with the Underground Railroad, he was working with Pinkerton, the guy he was an abolitionist, and they were getting people ferried up into Canada and things like that. Harriet Tubman meant to be with him on the raid. She was sick. Frederick Douglass thought that there would be too big of a mess created and that he would be better off and the whole cause served if he did not participate in the raid and then cleaned up whatever mess there would be after that. But Brown is waiting on one of the wagons from the Kennedy farm, from the John Brown farm here in Washington County. It doesn't show up. Brown mistakes that for success and ends up getting trapped there in Harper's Ferry and wounded, and then goes on from the trial to be convicted of 3 things that really aren't even real crimes. Sedition against the state of Virginia. There's no such law as that. And but he ends up, that time between his trial and his hanging, he's making appeals around the nation. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau, Victor Hugo, the author of Les Mis, they're all pleading for Brown's life. They're saying, this is a righteous man. Brown's not wrong, the society is wrong. Don't kill him. And as they do go ahead and hang him there, then his name is on the lips of Union soldiers from that point to the end of the Civil War.
And I think it was 3 charges, and the biggest one was an insurrection, right? So, coming full circle in history right now of thinking what he did and what he believed to be just in that insurrection time point, he was also charismatic in the way that he approached people. And I from what I understand was, people didn't like him when he was living, but they loved him and his lore, and he became a martyr once he was killed. And that also triggered a big exodus of abolitionists to leave the United States and actually leave the country after his death as well. And he had wrote hundreds of letters while he was awaiting his execution. So that kind of martyr really impacted others to kind of rally up. So the worst thing they could have did, it was kill him. Am I correct there?
Yeah, that's a good speculation. Yeah, I know. That's interesting.
When you look at the impact of everything that was done within our own community, after John Brown was killed, what do you see as the legacy impact in our community after he and the men that were with him were killed?
I would say almost nothing, amazingly enough there. I likened that on several occasions that property went from a place that was known. So W.B. Du Bois, when he's come down here kind of founding what became the NAACP, they went out to the place where John Brown's fort had been disassembled, taken up to the Chicago World's Fair there in 1892, 1893, put back together on a farm there and in a different spot than it is today. But they made a trek out there, took off their shoes, talking about it being hallowed ground. But then the farm itself, its history just kind of disappears until Leonard Curlin, who was at that time the head of this Elks Lodge here, we'll call it the Black Elks Lodge, the IBPOEW, he alerted the leaders of the national organization, IBPOEW, that property is for sale, and that's just at that time that they're aware that the civil rights is just not going to go anywhere. It's sort of like John Brown would have said, slavery's not going anywhere. And so if you're
And this
looking
was what time period?
so let me take you back just a little bit. The black community participated in World War I, and that was, the thinking there was, okay, we believe in liberty, and we believe in the United States, and we believe in the Constitution. Our problem is getting the white community to believe it, but we'll go fight in World War I with some promises that things are going to change. So they come back from that, and it's not changing. The Tulsa race riots are something that should be in every history book. They're getting to be in more and more. But here you've got, that was known as the Black Wall Street. So Wilbur and Orville Wright don't fly in their airplanes publicly. This is because of the way they were marketing their planes. They don't even fly them until 1908 publicly. Now you've got 13 years later, you've got 6 black businessmen in Tulsa, Oklahoma own airplanes, for instance. But when that riot happens, the Klan is really powerful in places like Indiana and throughout the South, and the citizens committees and all that kind of stuff. So when World War II rolls around, the black communities again, will you go fight in World War II? And there was a heavy contingent in the black community said, why? But the Elks are very patriotic. Their thing was just like, if you can get America, white America, to believe in its own constitution, the problem is solved. We'll have what John Brown wanted, the equality and the fraternity of the races. He was unique among abolitionists in that desire. The Pittsburgh Courier, the black newspaper, came up with the double V campaign, victory in Europe, victory here in the United States. This time it'll be different, everybody. They come back, and again, nothing's changed. In August of 1948, Truman integrates the troops, but there's no civil rights movement at that point. So the Elks and other fraternal organizations, you get Prince Hall Masons and such, but at the time, the Black Elks were the largest, most influential group. Their 2 leaders are very well connected. Judge Houston is the second in command. He'd been the president of the National Negro Baseball League. He organized the law library at Howard University, at the U.S. Post Office. The Elks, again, were very political. They had been wooed by FDR when he saw that some of the black vote was, for the first time since the Civil War, was starting to swing towards the Democratic Party, that the leader of the Elks there, J. Finley Wilson, was invited to the White House and thanked their, so they're very politically connected, but they're seeing that the civil rights movement is just going nowhere. We need inspiration. Where do we look for inspiration for the blood, sweat, and tears it's going to take for us to get this thing across the line ourselves? And so Leonard Curlin here in Hagerstown said, hey, that John Brown farm property is for sale. They went, perfect.
And I want to hold you right there as a tease for us to continue this conversation and bring this thing local into the next phase of the farm. So if you'll stay with us, and we'll come back after the break and we'll pick this up.
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. We'll have more with Ed after the break. Welcome back to the show. We're still joined by Ed Maliskas speaking about the history of John Brown's farm and his book, John Brown to James Brown. Where we left off last segment, we were starting to talk about the Black Elks and their importance in our community. So let's pick up there, and you can pick up the story and tell us more about the Black Elks and how influential they were here in our county.
Okay, so here we are. The civil rights movement is going nowhere after World War II. The Elks are looking for inspiration. They looked at John Brown, Leonard Curlin, who was a man who came up from Jamaica and was influential here in Hagerstown politics and owned businesses up on Jonathan Street. His wife owned a business there as well.
And he was a pastor. Correct?
He ended up being a pastor as well,
Yes.
yeah. And so he lets the national organization know that that property is for sale. They go, perfect. There is a man who did give his blood, sweat, and tears for the cause. They jumped on the property. The 2 leaders of the Elks bought it with their own money. They pitched it to the national organization at their annual convention, their Grand Lodge, the following summer of 1949. The property is conveyed to the Elks. They start building buildings there. They had plans ultimately to put up as many as 200 buildings on that property. It would have been the largest construction project in southern Washington County ever.
Wow.
But they didn't really get all that much up there. You got about 6 cabins, they renovated the barn, and they put up an auditorium for their own civil rights and fraternal purposes there. 50 by 124, something like that, that building was. And began having big rallies, 3,000 people on several occasions, maybe more on a third occasion, coming in from buses all over the East Coast, having picnics, barbecues, strategizing for civil rights. And just to let you know that, again, how important the Elks are here. At that time, there were 700,000 of them. 1 in 10 black men in the United States in the early 1950s was an Elk. Thurgood Marshall is an Elk. Martin Luther King Sr. is an Elk. Bojangles Robinson, just a number of doctors and lawyers. They got their own legal department, and they're like, let's go, let's get something done. So among the things that the Elks did all over the country, so they've got branches all over the country, they're starting to do constitutional awareness, literacy programs, voter registration. If there were any civil rights hot spots, like something's going down in Alabama, they could run money and people down there. James Meredith, for instance, that was killed for the cause, was an Elk. He was buried with his Elk's hat on his stomach. And so there is a quote here finally by these 3 Harvard authors, "What a Mighty Power We Can Be," that's talking about the influence of the Elks. And I'll just, well, here it is even. So by them reaching out to literally hundreds of thousands of members, teaching them valuable political skills, and fostering a social sensibility of racial solidarity and an understanding of civil rights activism as inherently patriotic, not communistic or something, the IBPOEW helped to create a mass army of dedicated, politically active African American citizens, without which the civil rights movement would not have been possible. It's the importance of these people. It is happening at John Brown's farm. That's their springboard. That's their source of inspiration. You can see it in their documents from their annual conventions. It's John Brown. It's what he did. It's what we need to piggyback on. We need to have the same fervor, the same price, the same dedication as John Brown did if we're ever going to get this thing across the finish line. And so they're working there to do that, and just hope we can at least, that's the short version of how we should appreciate how important the Elks were. And it is my contention, and I've been a voice in the wilderness about this, but I think that is the #1 black history site in the country, and I think that if the civil rights movement started anywhere, it started there. There was no movement until the Elks bought that property.
Now, I want to read more about that quote. Where did you just read that from?
That is from a book by 3 Harvard authors, "What a Mighty Power We Can Be." The subtitle is African American Fraternal Groups and the Struggle for Racial Equality.
And has that inspired any of your writing specifically?
It was too late for my book. I could only make vague things like that. This is a very important black history site. This is a very important civil rights site up till that point. So it came a little late for me getting into the book, but hopefully if I sell a few more copies, there'll be a second edition.
There you go.
Absolutely.
By the way, while we're there, how can people get how can our viewers get your book?
Well, thanks for asking. All the local area independent bookstores have them, as well as Pura Vida Coffee Shop in North Hagerstown. So,
is there any online outlet that
and
they can?
Amazon.com?
Okay. Because this is aired on Antietam Broadband, our partner. Well, I shouldn't say that. Where that airs our shows, but it's also on YouTube, so there might be some national
Wonderful.
attention.
Yeah, Amazon.com.
Great.
We have a little visitor there.
All right. Well, going back to the Black Elks as well, and you mentioned about the Constitution, and I believe I remember this fact. So correct me if I'm wrong. There was a time when African Americans were trying to vote, but one of the questions they required of them to vote was they asked them questions about the Constitution, and the Black Elks took it amongst themselves to educate voters about the Constitution. So at one point in history, a number of African Americans across this country was well versed in the Constitution from start to finish. Is that correct?
It was, and it gets a little embarrassing for Billy Bob and Jimmy Ray to be asking these black people they don't even think can read. You know, they would shove a piece of the Constitution and say, explain it to them. And if you went to an Elks Lodge, you could explain it to them.
Wow.
Also, they worked with youth as well, so there is still an annual oratorical contest. And when Martin Luther King Jr. participated in it, his topic was the Negro and the Constitution. But among the other people who have participated were Thurgood Marshall, Maya Angelou, and Oprah Winfrey.
Wow.
All participated that with the Elks. So Oprah, if you're listening, talk to me.
So now, just to kind of segue that, you know, transition, learn more, because you have another book here, The Family Tree of R&B. And music has always been important to African Americans from our roots to where we are today. What inspired that book?
That is actually an outtake from the first book. So my editor for the first book is Kate Rader, that many of you know here. She used to own and operate Hagerstown Magazine.
Right.
Did a beautiful job with the first book. I was interested, well, how did John Brown get to the farm? How did the Elks get to the farm? How did the young dancers? How did the musicians? How did everybody get to the farm? But I was also interested in how the music get to the farm, and Kate said, that's another book.
Okay.
So there it is. This is a very surprisingly American music form. There are 3 centers of music primarily in the early United States because there really were no roads. So everything is kept independent. You could get by ship to these different places. But it was the American Southeast. There was a mixing of West Africans and Scots-Irish there that had a very surprising musical connection, that they had both had people taken slaves by the North African Muslim slave traders, had taken black slaves, but they had also taken slaves from Western Europe and then also in Eastern Europe. The Janissaries, I don't know, those guys, the crack troops of the Ottoman Empire were actually castrated Slavs from Russia. So these guys are running their slave trade, but the music of the Middle Ages is reaching down into West Africa and also into Europe. So when they both get over here to the United States, their music is strikingly similar. So what became old-time music in the Southeast has got black and white roots to it. And then one of the other centers is New York City, very heavily influenced by European music, and not just classical music, but what became Broadway and vaudeville and all that. And then your third center is the Creole culture of New Orleans. And so in all 3 instances, you've got black and whites interacting musically, and that might be the only place, probably not church, a few churches, but probably not church, but sometimes with music. There was that interaction. And as you get railroads and Civil War and first the telegraph and then better roads and all that, then the music starts to interact, and you end up with just about the exact time that the Elks are purchasing John Brown's farm, so late 1940s, here comes what had been known in the black community as race music. You know, a race man is not somebody who's just out for, he's not just out for himself, he's out for the community. And so that was called race music. It was renamed R&B by Billboard magazine. And this music is coming along just in the early 50s there. Then you get Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The schools north of the Potomac River begin to integrate. The schools south of the Potomac don't integrate for another 10 to 11 years. So the kids that are going ultimately to these dances at John Brown's farm then are coming from, at first, segregated schools, and part of them from integrated schools, and then by just about the time John Brown's farm is being sold and the Elks leave and the music has become so popular that you couldn't afford to have these artists perform there anymore, R&B is full-blown America's music. So I was born in 1949. So it goes from being called race music to R&B in 48. In my lifetime, this has become the music of the world. the last Winter Olympics, so 4 years ago, it was in Seoul, Korea. The closing exercise, it's a bunch of Korean kids doing R&B.
And to think that our Super Bowl this year is being highlighted by R&B.
Yes, right.
That's true.
So in regards to that, but going back to the farm and the music at the farm,
Okay.
I know that, Terrence and I were there a few years ago when you had a panel discussion at the Fine Arts Museum where you had community members from our community that traveled to John Brown's farm. I know that you have interviewed many of them. Unfortunately, we've lost many of them over the last few years that have passed away. But talk about those interviews, what you learned from the people that went to the farms. The one person I really think about is that passed away last year was Mr. Leonard Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
The first haircut that I got when I came to Hagerstown 30 years ago was by Mr. Cooper.
Really?
But I just remember at your talk, he got up and danced. Well into his 80s. For that moment, he was a young man again. So talk a little bit about those experiences.
Yeah, so I'm hearing this story from Wendell Green, who also just passed away a couple of months ago. He's the only guy that ever told me about John Brown's farm. I never heard it. That, like you were saying, Terrence, just a little earlier, that to me, this is a God thing. I heard that story once. I'm a history major and a musician. Other people could have heard the story and dropped it. But I felt a solemn responsibility to follow up on that story. So I'm picking little threads of the story here and trying to knit them together. And somebody does fairly soon tip me off to Leonard Cooper. And so Leonard is quite the guy. I mean, so going back to John Brown's farm, in his days there, he lived in Charlestown at the time. He was simultaneously the best dresser. He sold his own clothes. He would do Zorro outfits in canary yellow and bright blue and capes that he could untie and swing around. And he was the best dancer there. He was plausibly the toughest guy there. People said he came from a family of fighters. They said somebody told me they could fight from the mama on down. They could all fight. And I asked Leonard about that. He said, it's true. One time my sister got mad and a man punched him in the face and knocked him out. So, I mean, this is a guy you want to interview, a guy that's got stories like that, right? So he is one among many people that were stars at John Brown's farm. And so now this story becomes a little bit like the Black Elks. One of the things that the Elks did is that you could be somebody that's an elevator operator, a black man, or sweeping floors somewhere. But when the Elks meet, you could be the grand exalted ruler. You're going to have to pull things together. You're going to have to make reports to the national organization. You have to learn how to run a meeting. You have to learn how to recruit people. So all these skills that are popping up there, that you are just a guy somewhere, but you're a guy once you get into the Elks Lodge, was like that for these black kids. Over a 6,000 square mile area from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to Front Royal, Virginia, on a weekly basis, you could just be washing dishes at the country club, but you would at John Brown's farm, and if you can dance, the dance floor will separate out for you. You will get a tip of the hat from James Brown, who may be rehearsing what becomes the next #1 R&B hit, that they haven't gone to the recording studio yet. The people that went to the dances, when I interviewed them, I interviewed over 125 people older than I am. I'm turning 73 pretty quick, so these people would have been 75, 76 at the youngest to go to these dances. So I would go to a black community somewhere where I thought maybe black people would congregate. I would take the risk of just pulling on somebody's sleeve and saying, excuse me, my name's Ed, can I ask you a question? They say, sure, what's going on? I say, do you ever remember hearing anything about John Brown's farm? And for almost uniformly, the first reaction was like, oh no, I've really offended somebody here, what's going on? They go, no, it's just that I haven't even thought about John Brown's farm for 30 years, and I never expected some white guy to ask me that question. But yes, I was at John Brown's farm. What do you remember? They would tell me what kind of clothes they wore, what they ate, how they got there. I was interested in all of it, but like, tell me about the performers. And they go, I don't remember much about that. And I thought, you just told me you saw James Brown, you saw Ike and Tina Turner, and finally somebody, I thought, adult beverages were involved. It was 50, 60 years ago. But somebody said, frankly, we were going to a dance. Mm-hmm. It was secondary to us who was on that stage.
I like how you said they separated till you can dance, they gave you the floor. Because that's still how it happens today. And that's inspiration for the Soul Train line that comes decades later in music as well. And that is funny to hear that and make that connection of what was happening on what they call the Chitlin circuit, right? To know that became mainstream on TV and became a Soul Train line that inspired American Bandstand and all these other shows of music as well that happened right here in this community. So that's amazing.
So John Brown's Farm was a major, I'd say maybe mid-major stop on the Chitlin circuit, but the Chitlin circuit could run anywhere. So that's a series of venues. There were about 3 circuits of the Chitlin circuit. So one was more out along the Mississippi River, and one's more maybe Houston over to Atlanta, Savannah, and then the other one running up the East Coast. And they would intersect. But you would see Mom's Mabley or Red Fox. You could see comedians there, or you could see anything. Ventriloquists, joke tellers, but primarily it was a music thing. And a lot of the major venues, like the Apollo Theater in New York City, or the Royal Theater, the Howard Theater, those things have been documented at the upper end of the Chitlin circuit. At the lower end of the Chitlin circuit, those were just little juke joints, somebody's garage, maybe an Elks Hall of the upstairs, or a tobacco warehouse, but those things aren't there anymore. This building is still there, that auditorium where the Elks held their things, but we're also, and I've just teased these artists a little bit, but where they were also, that was somewhere they would go. It was not maybe the highest paying place, but it was enough for, and more, for gas money to get to the next stop. The big draw was the segregated beach over in Annapolis, Maryland there, Carr's Beach. That was black owned. Little Willie Adams from West Baltimore had started off there as a numbers runner and worked his way up to legitimate businesses and became a golfer and belonged to the country club and was kind of a kingmaker in the Democratic Party and all. So he and a bunch of guys bought Carr's Beach. They upgraded the carnival rides. They built an auditorium there, and they would have dances there at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon that were broadcast by a little 1,000-watt black radio station over there by DJ Hoppy Adams. And if you were cool in Baltimore, you were listening at 3 o'clock to that radio show. And they would have people at the beginning like Count Basie and things like that, but then they worked all the way, and it stayed open long enough they would ended up finally having the Motown artists. But
Ed, I'm going to stop you right there. Excellent conversation. We would love to continue it more and talk more about the artists. So will you stay with us?
yes.
Excellent, excellent. All right. We'll be right back after the break with more with Ed Maliskas. Welcome back. We're still joined by Ed Maliskas, the author of John Brown to James Brown, with more exciting talk of John Brown's Farm and the exciting things that have happened in our community during this time. Ed, let's talk about the artists. Let's talk about those that performed at John Brown's Farm back in the 50s.
Oh man, this is the fun part here for me. The Elks are now on the property in the early 1950s. They start building buildings. They build a nice auditorium there. They're having some little combos come in. They're inviting some of the white kids down there in Dargan, and Dargan gets kind of the rap that it's very racist. There are hints of the KKK running around there and all that kind of stuff. But as I delved into this story, I didn't find one incident of hard feelings or any kind of shenanigans between the Elks and the white community down there. And I got to pat the Darganites on the back for this. I mean, there's busload after busload of black people coming down these terrible little roads down to John Brown's Farm, and it's all hunky-dory. So there is a black entrepreneur in Virginia, John Bishop, who is booking bands into his nightclub down there. And he's getting some fairly big names in there, but his nightclub can only hold about 100 people or so. He gets hooked up then with Rufus Mitchell, who is the manager over there at Carr's Beach in Annapolis, Maryland. And as they get to talking, they're kind of two peas in the pod of being entrepreneurs. And Mitchell is saying to Mr. Bishop, you know, I've got these big acts here, 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, but sometimes they don't have gigs on Sunday night or Saturday night. Would you want to look into that? And so John says, hey, let me check something out. He asked the Elks, can I rent this auditorium? And they're like, sure. He's a fellow Elk, not a problem. And so John begins booking in. Nobody can determine the exact date, but it had to be somewhere 1951, 1952, shortly after the auditorium is built. And he begins booking into the auditorium the giants of R&B. I have just a list here of the artists who performed there. There are scores of them. I've documented over 60. There was a process there. You know, like a lot of people were telling me, I saw Percy Sledge there. And I'm like, Percy Sledge didn't have a hit until after the Elks sold that property. So I don't think Percy Sledge. But so I had to go through a process of, it had to be two people not in the same family that had a recollection of their time at John Brown's farm. And there was Leonard Harris, who is still living, would sometimes go in with Mr. Bishop kind of on a last minute deal to book the bands in there. So if Mr. Harris said they were there, they were there. There were some other criteria. But here's just a partial list of who's there. Chuck Berry, James Brown, Ray Charles, The Coasters, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, The Drifters, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, the Isley Brothers, B.B. King, Little Richard, Wilson Pickett, The Platters, Otis Redding, Ike and Tina Turner, Jackie Wilson, Chubby Checker, Eartha Kitt, and Dionne Warwick. Those last two are the ones that kind of really blow my mind, because Eartha Kitt was an international superstar by the mid-1950s. So I can't verify this, but I'm thinking probably the Elks booked her in there directly themselves. Mm-hmm. And then at the other end of things, Dionne Warwick, she's also a superstar. And just trying to think like, wow, how did Mr. Bishop get all those people in there? Well, he was hooked up with New York booking agencies, and after a while, as I said earlier, that has become a rather famous little spot on the Chitlin circuit. And so they would come in there. These dances wouldn't even start till midnight, and sometimes not even till 3 in the morning. So some of these artists could play somewhere else, pack up, get over to John Brown's farm, unpack, set up, and then boogie all night long with their peers. And that was another fantastic thing about it, is that this music is becoming more and more refined as well. If you listen to some of the stuff that was on the R&B charts, say B.B. King had a couple of #1 hits in the early 50s, and Fats Domino has just kind of got some rolling kind of piano from New Orleans, and B.B. King is kind of playing straight up blues. You don't really have R&B yet. You've got streams of it coming together. But these kids, again, these thousands of black kids over the years who would come to the dances, you would normally see 300 to 600, 700, 800 kids there. Half of them would go inside, half of them would just party outside. They'd set up, they'd play softball beforehand, they'd swap stories, they'd flirt, they'd admire each other's clothing, the new paint job on their vehicles, just shooting the breeze. They could walk through the property and there'd be these like moonshiny kind of guys when these open up the coat and they got little flasks of whiskey you could buy there, or you could buy it at Lily's Tavern up there in Dargan. And there's just a party going on. You may never get inside and still have a great time there. But as you did get inside, then they've got the disco ball. I thought that was, something from the 70s or something. I've got a picture of the interior of that auditorium from 1951. There's that disco ball hanging there. It's still hanging there in tatters.
Yes, it is. It is still hanging there.
And right below it is the Elks insignia. And that would be, if you were really showing off, you would probably have to dance right atop that insignia. But they're coming in there to see this emerging music form by kids their own age. So I'm growing up in central Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. We get bandstand on there, and I'm figuring the best dancers in the United States got to be those Italian kids from South Philly. But now I don't think so. I think it's those kids from our area here who were leaving town. You know, it was illegal in Hagerstown for black people to be outside of the Jonathan Street neighborhood after dark for a time and then after midnight for a time, except to go pick up coal at the railroad yards. So to go down to John Brown's farm, you not only had to be sneaking away from your parents probably, but just to get down there was an adventure. You're going on roads, there's no street signs, there's no street lights. You're getting down there in windy, twisty roads, and you pull into John Brown's farm, and here are a bunch of your peers. You may have had to be shucking and jiving and yes ma'am and yes sir and oh, I sure was funny, boss, kind of a life, but you got down to John Brown's farm, and it is a black entrepreneurial experience. The bands are black. 95 to 98, maybe sometimes 100% of the kids going to the dances are black. The sheriff's deputies are black. It's just whatever you had to do to get by from Monday through Friday in Hagerstown or Charlestown or Harrisburg or Winchester. You could go down to John Brown Farm, come onto the property, see just the fun that was going on. It was a very safe, professional thing. Mr. Bishop was a dignified man. Just usually, you know, if you're going to a John Bishop event, you know, just to act right. And if you didn't act right, then the on-site caretaker, Maynard Henderson, would be there, and Maynard had a gun in his pocket. And if that wasn't good enough, then Bill Mason and other black sheriff's deputies were patrolling the property, and they had a dog. And the dog's, I think his name was Satan, and he, as one guy said, if you didn't watch it, Bill would turn that dog loose on you and take a chunk out of your ASS if necessary. So, but generally it wasn't necessary. There were fights there, but it was people who wanted to fight. It would be the guys who worked at the racetrack might want to get into a little skirmish with the guys that are the apple pickers, but they would dust themselves off, buy each other a beer, and be lifelong friends. It just wasn't a nasty kind of a thing. It was a fun thing. And I can't tell you how many people told me that they would say this: we made Tina Turner. So how did you make Tina Turner? Ike had that, what was it, Olds 88 or something. He had a big hit earlier before he ever met Tina. Now, so how'd you make Tina Turner? He said, well, when Tina first started down here, she was pretty demure, that we would egg her on until she became the Tina Turner you see today. And just a wonderful guy, still living, Al Baylor, a wonderful interview, and he's in the book, John Brown to James Brown. But he said that when he saw Ike and Tina Turner, he said, I was standing about 6 feet away from Tina Turner. And I said, Al, what were you thinking? He said, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking. I was looking at that woman thinking that she was a lot older than me. He said, she was my age. She might even been a little bit younger. He said, what I was thinking was, we don't have any women in Charlestown like this. And sadly, there was one time when Ike and Tina Turner were playing, they were on break, the dressing room's back behind the stage in the corner of the auditorium, and there was some thumping and bumping back there, and one of the black deputies went back there to check things out, and Ike was whacking Tina around there. And the deputy grabbed Ike and put him up against the wall and said, you know, if you want to hit me, hit me. If you want to hit something, hit me.
Wow.
And he set Tina down. Tina put on her makeup and went out, and it was on with the show. But so another time there was a rumor. There was either a fire or a rumor of a fire in the room, and Ray Charles purportedly was the first guy out of the room. And almost all of us know Ray Charles is blind.
I guess the rest of his senses were sharp.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, clearly. Very sharp, very sharp.
And you read those names, and they just reminded me of the soundtrack of my Saturday mornings. Like, as soon as you started reading those names, like, I smelled ammonia, I smelled bleach, because I knew that was the music that my aunts and my mother, they cleaned the house to on Saturday mornings. And the music even adjusted and became a little bit more sensual in the evenings when it was time for us to go to bed. But but just to know that tradition.
And you still remember that.
I still remember it. That's right. That's right. I still use the soundtrack today myself. Passed down. But to know that's that Saturday culture. That Saturday culture that stemmed from the music that was happening in the Elks and the fraternity that you keep hitting on that the Elks created, and how these business owners and entrepreneurs were connected and had a fraternity to one another and looked out for one another states away, separate businesses, but were connected through a fraternity first and found ways to be entrepreneurs, successful, and contribute to the culture through music and history. So it's amazing to hear what those fraternal organizations did at that time.
Yeah, well said. And among those artists, now the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is not the be-all and end-all. It doesn't totally verify something, but I've been there. That first hallway is R&B, and I could have stayed there for hours just there. But in the inaugural class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, half of the class, I forget now, is it 5? I think it's 5 of the 10 in the artist class performed at John Brown's farm. Over the first 3 years of inductees, almost half of them played at John Brown's farm. This is the foundation of rock and roll. It's the foundation of R&B, soul music, dance music, rap. There are so many genres of dance music and hip hop and all over the world just keeps moving and gravitating. This actually is the world's music, and it came to perfection here and places like this, but in a very special way. It would be different than the Apollo Theater, where everybody's out there sitting in chairs. And it would be different. These guys wouldn't even, at this point, play those little tobacco warehouses and stuff. They were getting too big for that. But to be at John Brown's farm and to be there with your peers, feet away, dancing, cheering you on, causing you to become better performers, to where just in a few more years now, with integration, with some of these daring black and white DJs that are starting to play this music, with Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley and other people saying, you know, if you don't include Ella Fitzgerald, or if you don't let black kids and white kids integrate at my concerts, I'm not coming. That this becomes, in short order, now America's music. Let's go to 1955, and you're to Hagerstown credit, they integrated those schools rather quickly after Brown versus Board in '54. They said the next year, if you're a black kid and you want to go to the historic black high school next year, you can. If you're a white kid and you want to go to the historic white school next year, you can, or you can switch now. But next year, when we get what became South High, it's integrated from this point on. And so there now, you've got guys who were playing on separate basketball teams. The Elks had a lot of bands, and maybe some local kid, if not here in Hagerstown, but somewhere, would be in the Elks marching band or something like that. But next year, now, you got a black kid playing trombone and a white kid playing trombone. You got a black kid in a chemistry class and a white kid in a chemistry class. And they're starting to talk on the team bus about what kind of music do you listen to. And I tell you, some white music at that point was pretty sad. I mean, how about, how much was that dog in the window? Arf, arf! The one, and somebody slaps on Smokey Robinson and the Miracles or something like that and say, let me hear that again.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, you know, so that the things that John Brown wanted to do for the equality and fraternity, the integration of the races, the things that the Black Elks wanted to do, being very patriotic. You know, I've spoken at the last 4 opening sessions of the Black Elks National Convention. They've invited me to speak there, and just to see them with a very Christian base, a very constitutional base, they bring in the flag, that these values that John Brown lived out on that property, that the Elks lived out on that property, these kids going to that dances got to feel it, to feel the liberty of what America could be like. That those are the values we need. And I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, I'm called to be a peacemaker, and a peacemaker brings people from 2 ends and tries to bring them into the middle. And we've got a lot of philosophies out there in our culture today that just wants to immediately divide people into camps, rather than to say, you know, if this Constitution was believed and acted out, we would have a just, prosperous, multicultural, happy society that I'm a little jealous of those kids that went to the dances. I would like to have been there myself, but I can't even imagine the contrast of the lack of freedom that you could feel on a day-to-day basis, then go to John Brown's farm and have it be a portent of what could happen in the future. I really am just tickled to death that America's got a place like that
Yes.
on 3 different ways have lived out the inherent values of liberty.
Wow.
I think that's an excellent spot to leave this conversation. We're going to definitely have to have you back to talk about this more. I think the thing that this conversation encapsulates is that our community is so connected to the national story when it comes to African American history and our contributions. And we've been underserved that our school systems don't have this information and our general public don't. But I believe we're in a renaissance period where, with all the work that is happening throughout our community, that we're going to be able to celebrate these things even more. And, you know, Terrence and I have served in an advisory capacity in regards to the owner of John Brown's farm, and we're looking to bridge the gap there to help that property return to its prominence in our community, which should have an economic impact in regards to tourism and other things as well. So thank you very much for joining us. This was absolutely awesome. I know that there's some other things that we do want to talk about with you, but we'll have to bring you back for those.
I'll do it.
All right, excellent. That's all the time that we have for tonight. We hope that you'll like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and send us your comments to feedback@theflipsidetv.com. That is feedback@theflipsidetv.com. But most importantly, we hope you'll join us again for another episode of The Flip Side.
It's all good, baby.
Is it really all good?
If you love me enough to routinely test your handyman skills, not to mention the strength of your marriage, then of course you'll visit nhtsa.gov/therightseat to make sure I'm in the right car seat.